So I'll just get on with
The most outstanding introduction I've ever had.
Thank you.
I'll introduce myself. Nabeel Hamdi. I studied as an architect and qualified as an architect, but very quickly began my career not so much in the conventional world of designing special buildings and the like, but working for the Greater London Council, which is, at the time when I started in 1972, I think it was, one of the biggest public landowners in the world, big public housing program. And it was my first effort, based on my thesis, to try and introduce participatory methods and planning to low-income families. So we designed a series of housing projects with very low-income families. I then went to the States and I spent nearly 12 years there, about 10 of them in teaching at MIT in Cambridge, Massachusetts, after which I returned to Oxford, where I set up a program called the Center for Development and Emergency Practice, largely geared towards architects, planners and the rest, but who are interested in the relief development continuum, as we call it. How you make an emergency response with a view to the fact that it's the first step for a long-term development program. My practice work has been for, I suppose, most of the major UN agencies, UNDPs, UNHCR. I worked with UNRWA, which was probably one of the first UN agencies set up to look after the Palestinian crisis after the Second World War. So I was working with refugee camps, and I worked for also some of the major non-government organizations, CARE, Habitat for Humanity, and the likes. I can tell you more about that in a minute as I go into my talk. I basically today want to spend the next 40 minutes, 35-40 minutes, not much longer, talking to two recent books that I produced. The first was called Small Change, which is all about how very small, simple interventions, if carefully targeted, can be scaled up. And the second was more the method of how to go about doing that, and it's called The Placemaker's Guide to Building Community, which is a little bit more, it's nice stories, if anybody wants a short read, nice stories. This is a little bit more academic, a little bit more heavy, a little bit more planning. But I want to kind of refer to both books throughout, and I'm going to leave these with Sam here, Sam Smith, and they will find their way one day, fairly soon, to your library. Let me start off. I suppose, I know that most of you are architects, and so I want to direct my talk to you this evening largely about my belief in the way in which the architectural profession can become more relevant to some of the big crises out there. How do we engage? And I start with a rather curious statistic that came out of UN Habitat a little while ago. And they had estimated that something like 5% of the built environment globally is actually planned or designed. Now, I don't care if it's 5% or 6% or 10%. It's a heck of a small amount that is formally planned through what we would consider to be the professionals. If that's true, I ask myself, then why is it that we tend to spend most of our time in the profession, all right? 95, I would say, percent of the profession goes chasing those 5% of the jobs. Those are the jobs that we aspire to. You know, the Norman Fosters and the Frank Gearys and the Richard Rogerses and you name them. Those are the magazines we have open on our drawing boards and the rest of it. Yeah? Why is it that 95% of our profession goes chasing 5% of the jobs when we know that the real issues are in the other 95%? Okay? And let me remind you, and again I quote just a few statistics, and I promise you there won't be any more numbers after this, but cities in the developing world, which is where I mostly work, most of my work is urban, will account for something like 95% of the urban expansion over the next 2 decades, and by 2030, 4 billion people will live in cities, 1.4 billion in slums and informal settlements. And you can say even today there are countries, places like Ghana for example, 4.8 million people live in slums. That's 45% of the urban population. It's huge. 55% in Kenya, 66% in Tanzania, that's 6.2 million people live in informal settlements and slums, 35% in India, and so on. So anyone who comes to me and says, yes, the poor and the vulnerable in the informal settlements or wherever are the minority, is talking, and I won't mention the word. The question that I have is, what does design and what does planning mean for the other 95%? Right? And that's the big question that has interested me throughout. How can we make our professions relevant to the big issues out there? And I start with 3 assumptions that I want you to share. I don't want you to agree, we can have a discussion about them, but 3 assumptions which I suppose have shaped my work over the last number of years, and certainly are the basis for both of the books that I have written here. And I'd argue that together, those 3 assumptions, I'd like you to think about it, fundamentally change not only the way we work, but obviously also the way we think. And shifting the way we think, shifting the way we work is relatively easy. It becomes instrumental unless we change our thinking. You know, all the participatory methods, all the tools and techniques out there, all the guidebooks, all that stuff's great. All right? But to pick it up and use it, recognizing that our mindsets are still in the old ways, renders those books and those guidebooks and those rules and methods instrumental to the point where they become dangerous. I have been on exercises where people have conducted what they call these participatory rapid appraisal techniques, of which mapping is one example. I remember in India seeing a family doing a mapping exercise sitting under a tree, and I went up there and I said, "What are you doing?" They said, "We're mapping." I said, "Why are you mapping?" "Because we want a house." "Why does the map produce a house?" "I don't know," they said. "They said we had to do a map before we have a house." So it became instrumental. Somehow in the tick list, you had to do a PRA exercise, a mapping exercise, so that you would seem to be engaged before you could actually have your house. Instrumental. 3 assumptions that I want you to share. And the first is a basic assumption about the nature and scope of practice. Right? And you say, well, we all know what practice is. Think back to the old days. Practice was about being practical. Yeah? It was about solving problems, putting buildings up, whatever you did in your own background, your own business, to solve problems. It was about dealing with contractors and all that tendering stuff that goes with it. Yeah? Practice, in other words, was about doing. Come on in, you're in the right place. Practice was about doing. And to be creative as an architect, and I would argue almost any other professional in the development business, yeah, you had to be in control of everything. You had to be, you are taught to be, the lead agent. It all starts with me. I'm in charge. God forbid, in any of your crits, you should stand up and someone asks a question and say, well, I'm not too sure what the colour of that wall is going to be. Fail. Right? We want to know about the handles, door handles, the colour of the wall, everything. You are in control. What do you mean you don't know? Right? Which of course is entirely the opposite to what we confront when we get out there in the mess of practice. Issues of participation and change are always, under the old model, seen as an interference, something that gets in the way of excellence, design excellence. All right? People, after all, are a mess. Get them out of the way so that I can be creative. Yeah? Today, all right, if we go back to what is the nature and scope of practice, today I think we're coming to terms with a different agenda. And particularly if we are, as a profession, whatever your professions are, to engage effectively with some of the global issues that are out there that are induced by poverty, climate change, man-made disasters, and the rest of it. Those are the big issues. And particularly to engage those issues at a scale that counts. It's all right fiddling with them, but how do we engage with that agenda out there that can no longer be, as in the old days, that's somebody else's problem. It sounds to me like that's a bit about social science and anthropology. I design buildings, and we know that how many drawings you see of buildings with people really in them. Best that you can see of a person in a building on a drawing of a building is that nice triangular person with an abstracted head. And even then, there are only few, and they look terribly awkward and nervous, standing in the environment that the drawing is created. Think about it. Yeah? How do we engage? And I think we are getting to the point of beginning to engage at some of those issues. Of course, there's no doubt about it. The practice is about solving problems. There's no question about it. Let's get off that mark. It's not either or. But it's also today about social need, about moral accountability, trading very often very narrow ethical lines between the two worlds, ethical and unethical, depending on who your clients are, who you choose to engage with, in whose service you really are, whose interests you really bring to bear on. Always a question of morality, moral accountability. It's about rights. It's about removing discrimination. It's about environmental justice and about issues of vulnerability and all that entails. And as I say, as soon as I come to this point, usually in the room, all the architects go, "Oh, thank goodness, none of these things are really our problems. I design buildings." You can no longer say that if you want to be relevant. Yeah? In other words, if I was to sum it up, practice, of course, has to be practical. It's also about doing, but practice has also to take on a more strategic agenda. Now, and here's where it gets complicated. Well, not really complicated, because everybody says, "Oh, strategic agenda, that means policy." I don't do policy, I do practice. It's wonderful divisions that we have all the way down the line. The question in my mind is, how can you be practical in a way that delivers practical goods and services, whether it's housing or school design or shopping mall, I don't care what you do, but in a way that begins to invoke that strategic agenda. Now the question is, what is being strategic? And there are 6 things to think about. And I'm not going to go into detail, but I think 6 things to think about. And the first, being strategic, is inevitably about inducing change. Development ultimately is about change. And the question then is, what is it that we're disturbing? What right do we have to be present in some of the communities that we wind up working in that induces change? 3 kinds of change. Change in professional conduct, and I'll come back to that in a minute. What I mean by that is that we have to rewrite our code of conduct. Right? It's not good enough for the kind of work that we're talking about here. Yeah? And in principle, if I was to put it in a strap line, the professional code of conduct, we have to move away from the idea that the expert alone is some special kind of person, and accept that every person out there is some special kind of expert. If you didn't believe that, then the whole participation thing becomes a sham. You know? I engage with people not because I like them. In fact, they also get in my way. It's time-consuming, it's messy, everyone argues, it's shouting, there's conflict, all the rest of it. I engage with them in the same way as I would engage an engineer if I was putting up a complex building. I would be stupid not to engage an engineer, right? Put up a complex building. Well, how come I don't engage with the expert out there that knows best, the tacit knowledge that they have and all the other knowledge about how to really survive and live? If I could survive on less than $1 a day, which is really with most of the communities that I work with, I would consider myself to be incredibly creative. Right? I need that knowledge. That intelligence is not in the planning office, much as I love planning offices, I don't know who's here for planning offices. It's in the street. Right? I need to engage with the street as my source of knowledge. You can call that what you like. Practical wisdom, indigenous knowledge, there are lots of lovely terms for it. But that's where I want to get at. So, change in professional conduct that repositions us and not just makes us feel better about ourselves. Second, change in practice process. Right? And here, some of the terms you're familiar with. The discussion about new kinds of partnerships in putting up housing, putting up buildings, or whatever it is you do. Participatory methods, right? Partnerships, participation, empowerment, enablement, big words, come back to that later on. And then there's change that we introduce inevitably when we intervene, which is the one that I started with. I like to use the word disturbs. Practice always disturbs. Yeah? It disturbs because our very presence may raise expectations, may change gender relations. Our very presence invokes fear, anticipation, raises aspirations, artificially or otherwise. Right? In the interest of who? Sometimes we're invited to disturb because things are not going well. Sometimes we disturb by mistake because we stumble into things that we don't understand, culturally, particularly as outsiders. Right?